Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Egypt. I'm Mike Hanna. The slogan remains, Egypt fights terrorism. That's how Egyptian state media portrayed the fight against the Muslim Brotherhood in the months following the military takeover. And now Egypt's interim cabinet has approved new security legislation designed to take what it calls its fight against terror even further. Few details are known about its specifics, but the Justice Minister says it will broaden the government's definition of what it calls terrorism and introduce tougher punishments for those convicted of the crime. The new legislation follows a number of bombings and shootings in recent months that have largely been aimed at security forces. The government has repeatedly pinned the blame on the Muslim Brotherhood. On Wednesday, a police general was killed and 5 policemen were injured when 3 bombs exploded near Cairo University. And in February, an armed group known as Ansar Bait al-Maqdis claimed responsibility for an attack on a bus in the Sinai Peninsula. In the same month, a group called Anjad Miza said it was behind an attack on a vehicle carrying army conscripts outside of Cairo. Egypt's government says almost 500 people... Joining us on the line from Cairo, we've got Abdullah Al-Ashaal, a professor of international relations and law at the American University of Cairo. He's also a former diplomat in the Egyptian Foreign Ministry. Welcome to you all. Let's begin in Cairo with Abdullah Al-Ashaal. What sort of reaction has there been to news of even more stringent security legislation?
I think the reactions are not easily recorded because the freedom of expression is very much limited. And I think that some organizations which are working in the field of human rights are tentatively criticizing the measures. And I think also that fear in Egypt is not very much encouraging any criticism because it's a matter against terrorism. And since terrorism has become the first slogan and the major slogan of the government, without identifying which are the acts of terrorism and what are the groups who have to be classified as terrorists. I think that these organizations are saying that it is a new phase of restricting the freedom of expression. So if we take it generally speaking, I think we are not adding anything tangible to what is existing in our legislation, in the criminal law and the criminal procedure law.
Well, let me go to Sahar Aziz in New York on that particular point. There is a plethora of security legislation already in existence. Why does the interim government feel the need for even more stringent measures?
I think there are 2 reasons. One is political, in that they are clearly capitalizing on the very unfortunate violence that has occurred in Egypt as a result of what occurred on July 3rd, whether it's the deposal of Morsi or the military coup. And so it is a political opportunity to expand presidential powers. And so what they're doing is they're using counterterrorism law, which other countries have done, including the United States and European countries, in order to expand those powers. And we don't have a copy of the law. They won't release it. The government won't release it. However, media reports consistently state that the definition of terrorism is going to expand. And one particularly problematic expansion, if true, is that any act that undermines national unity could be considered an act of terrorism so long as there is the use of force, violence, threat, or intimidation. And arguably, that could include labor strikes, that could include very effective and sophisticated advocacy campaigns by NGOs where they mobilize citizens to oppose the government or to oppose government policies. And so I think this is, the devil is in the details. And so to the extent that they are using the current political situation and the fear and the violence to expand the law so that it can in the future quash dissent by groups that are not terrorist groups in the traditional sense, then this is clearly a political move.
Well, sorry, Eltantawi, it would appear that the interim government is confident that it has the backing of many Egyptians in terms of introducing this legislation.
Yeah, I think that that's actually the really key point, because as we've seen since July 3rd of last year, the government has hardly needed laws to crack down on pretty much whoever they want to in the name of national security, and we've seen really a limitless drive to do so. So I don't think that, unfortunately, Egypt is not operating at the moment quite that legally. So it's not the introduction of these counterterrorism laws, I would agree, is political, but I would also add that the kind of, I think, more interesting point that we really need to, as analysts, really start to understand is that this could not be possible without the fact that there's almost guaranteed public support. Why is there almost guaranteed public support for these types of measures? We need to, I would, as an analyst or as a scholar also of the Muslim Brotherhood, take a step back and really look at the relationship between this group and the Egyptian government, whether it was the monarchy through the free officers through to the present, the relationship between these two organizations, this constant push and pull and constant relationship that they have. And I think that the best case for Egypt now is for us to step back and to understand, to try to think of ways to get out of that particular dynamic. So I'm weary of coming down sort of on the side too much of one side or the other, because really what we're seeing is the enactment of a kind of historical dance that's been in place for 80 years.
I want to go with to Abdullah Alshaal with something that you brought up there. This legislation, it would appear, is very general. It's not specific to the Muslim Brotherhood, as, for example, the legislation outlawing the movement last year is. Is this intentional to make it as wide as possible, do you believe, to shift the focus away from a single organization such as the Muslim Brotherhood to a wider variety of dissenters?
I think you have to read the political situation while you are trying to examine the tenor of this law or the measures which are declared now. We didn't see anything concrete. I think since the 3rd of July, there is a general campaign against those who have been included in the Islamic political Islam and the center, the Muslim Brotherhood. So launching a campaign against them is very radical, and I think many measures have been taken in this regard, including declaring the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist group, and also making many demarches with Britain and some other states as to make the campaign very strict and global. In these circumstances, these measures are intended to rectify the situation in Egypt and to be against anyone who is making any demonstration against the government or criticizing any measure, including the Muslim Brotherhood, of course. So if you are going to stop the violence, you have to stop the violence of everybody, not only those who are acting for something else. So you have the state and you have the street. So you have to control both of them. And I think, to my mind, this is not possible without a political solution. You are treating that, or you are concerned with the consequences of the non-solution on the political level.
Well, let me go to Sahar Aziz on a point that has been brought up here, the relationship between the Muslim Brotherhood and other organizations. We've heard claims of responsibility for the violence, for example, from Ansar Bayt al-Maqdis, from Anjad Musa. Yet, interestingly enough, no individual from any of these organizations has yet appeared in a court. The government appears intent on establishing a linkage, yet it has not successfully done so at this particular point. Is that correct, you believe?
Well, I think what the question highlights a very important problem in the legal system, or at least in the current situation politically and legally, which is there's very little transparency. And this is why law does matter and procedure matters and process matters, is that the outcome for it to be legitimate, needs to be transparent, and it needs to be according to processes and procedures that are communicated to the public, so that you can determine for yourself, if you're a citizen, whether the government's conviction of a particular group or the sentencing of a particular individual is in fact based on their wrongful deeds, as opposed to a political vendetta and a much larger and historical political dispute between major political actors in the Egyptian system. But I wanted to respond to Ms. Tantawi's comment about public opinion. I think the problem we have is we really don't know public opinion in Egypt, because you have this combination of the absence of a free press, which I think is very significant. It's not, I mean, even though it's easy to dismiss government propaganda as something minor, the absence of a free press is a major contributor to informing the populace and ensuring that whatever their decisions are, they're based on accurate information. The second is there's very little polling that's permitted in Egypt. And the third is the consequences of dissent and expressing your opposition to government policies right now is literally your life, if not your liberty. And so it's very difficult to know what percentage of the public is supporting this extent of the quashing of dissent, as opposed to simply saying, I'm not in favor of the Brotherhood or I don't support Morsi. That's one issue. But the real issue is, to what extent are Egyptians supporting this regression back to the authoritarian state, this regression back to the police state, where violence, state violence, becomes the modus operandi for dealing with any kind of conflict and any kind of dispute.
Well, sorry, Eltantawi, your response to that, is there a separation out within the Egyptian public in the public analysis of the situation that, well, we are told that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization, yet it does appear that there are others who are being arrested and may well be arrested in terms of the new legislation, who are not members of that organization but are merely guilty of public dissent? Your view?
Yes, it does indeed appear that this law is extremely sweeping, and of course it's aimed at the general counter-revolution that has been put forward since the events of July 3rd of last year. It's just that I think it does us a disservice to not understand that the point that we're at right now in Egypt is, in a strange way, one that was asked for by a lot of people. And I'm not sure, I think that if you can rely on other modes of analysis besides quantitative polling to understand some of these attitudes. It is my conviction that a lot of this would not be possible were there not public support, first of all, against Morsi's rule, and of course the government leveraged that lack of support for Morsi's rule to go very, very far, and far further, I would argue and agree, than probably many people had ever asked for. But if we, again, I'm always wanting to kind of stand outside the binary here, that it's now so many of the analysts. I noticed something, that so many analysts who had criticized, for example, the Morsi regime from the first day that they took power, really sort of relentlessly criticizing that regime, and then when that regime was removed, a lot of those same analysts sort of pivoted to relentlessly criticizing the Sisi and that regime. And I think that the truth of the matter is that many Egyptians essentially just are hankering for security and for a return to a stabilized economy. And I think it is important for us as analysts and as people who truly want to understand what's happening in Egypt and care about what's happening in Egypt, to really recognize that experiment, that year of Morsi in power, failed in the eyes of a lot of average people in Egypt. This is not simply, the elite that had a problem with it. And so it was that, that historical trajectory, what actually took place, that allows now for the government to come in and, in my opinion, far overplay their hand and act in ways that are, frankly, completely reckless.
Well, let's just take a look at how far it's overplaying its hand, and just pause at this stage There are a myriad of people on trial in Egypt facing security charges. Many of those, as we said, are members or supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. They include Mohamed Badi, the group's general guide, who appeared in court this week. Deposed President Mohamed Morsi is also standing trial. But a large numbers of others with no relation to the Brotherhood, such as activists and journalists, are also facing terrorism charges. We are looking at a situation here, going to Sahar Aziz in New York, where there is an absolutely overburdening of the legal process, of the courts themselves, it would appear. The courts are snowed under with hundreds, if not thousands of cases ongoing all the time. To mention the one example, some 500 people sentenced to death on the basis of 2 hearings by a judge. That seemed like a court under a lot of pressure with very little time to do things. How much does this impact on the society as a whole, where justice, while being seen to be done, it may be argued, may not be regarded as justice at all?
Well, I think this is where I admittedly have a bias as an attorney, is that I am trained and I do have my conviction that process matters, transparency matters. And if we want the law to be relevant in any society, then we have to take it seriously. And I think what's happening now, for example, with this counterterrorism law and these prosecutions of youth revolutionaries, prosecution of journalists, mass death sentences after the second hearing, which most judges in Egypt find to be an affront to judicial independence, all of this is delegitimizing the law. And when you delegitimize the law and make the courts irrelevant and the law irrelevant, you force people into the streets. You force people to have to resolve their disputes through violence. And you essentially exasperate pre-existing disputes and pre-existing disagreements, which predated, part of it arose from July 3rd, part of it arose from the Morsi's regime's failure in many, many aspects, part of it has arisen through decades of authoritarianism. And so what I think is very important for us to think about is how can we use nonviolent means, and we meaning the state as well as the citizenry, to resolve very real disputes and disagreements on the future of the country. And so I think the critique of, for example, the July 3rd coup, dissolution, uprising, whatever you want to call it, was about process. I think that many people who criticize the government's overreaching and authoritarian tactics, I mean, it's textbook. Some NGO leaders and human rights activists are actually saying that it's worse than the days of Mubarak, which is quite worrying in light of what January 25th was supposed to represent. And so when you look at that and you ask yourself, is this what Egypt should become? Even though people wanted Morsi out, and I agree with Ms. Eltantawi that many, many people were unhappy with Morsi's rule, I think the question was, how do you go about removing a failed leader? Do you go through elections? Do you go through nonviolent uprisings? Do you go through the military? And I think that is the fundamental difference. And now we are in a situation where it's really trying to deal with reality.
Well, let's go to Abdallah Alshaal on that particular point, if I may interrupt, Sahar. That point that the legislation being put in place to create security, that's what the interim government says is doing. Some are arguing, as we've heard indicated at here, that it actually encourages dissent. This kind of security crackdown becomes a cause rather than a solution to the problem of insecurity and of ongoing dissent. What's your view on that, Abdallah Alshaal?
Yes, I think that they are trying to solve the problem from behind. They are not going directly to the core of the problem itself. And this is why I'm in favor of the second view, that these figures are going to frustrate the situation and is going to increase the tension in the street. Because, to my mind, the measures in the government are the maximum that could be taken in any circumstances. And despite all that, violence did not stop. And it is taking very bad harvest in the lives of top police officers. And it is also
me go to Sahar Eltantawi with that particular point, if I may, Dr. Abdullah. That point being made there, that actually it is having the reverse effect, that people are getting more insecure because of the consequences, the reaction to the exercise of such stringent legislation. Do you believe that that is the case?
Absolutely. I think that that is the case. And I actually sometimes go so far as to think that the regime wants to keep perpetuating the Islamist threat. I think that that actually matches up with my reading of history, that these two groups actually need each other, and that if you, one way of looking at the behavior of the current regime is that they've exacerbated the problem. I mean, you know, when you have a death sentence of 529 people in one day, this is an outrageous move. This is, I understand it's the judiciary, but and not necessarily the regime, although I think one can certainly draw a connection. But I think that one way of looking at it is that the regime is actually perpetuating the Islamist threat, and that the Islamist threat survives on the regime's brutality. And so once again, I'm always wanting to step back and see a way that we can get ourselves out of this binary between the regime and the Islamists. And one of the concerns I have, and you know, we spent so much time talking about the nomenclature of what took place last year. One of my concerns is that if we come down rhetorically too one-sided, which is this is a junta, this is a coup, this had absolutely nothing to do with any public support, which I do, you know, I think that you get a lot of that analysis, and of course that analysis grows as the regime becomes more brutal. The problem I see with that is that it lets the Islamist side of the equation off the hook, and then my fear there is that we then swing back into a period in which the Islamists pose themselves as the absolutely wronged victims, and then kind of pave a way back into power, and then we then have the same story happen again with increasing levels of brutality each time.
A circular course of events. But I want to go very quickly to Sahar Aziz on the point that you made there. Is there indeed a symbiotic relationship between the Islamic movements, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, and the interim government? They need each other. Is that the case?
I do agree with Ms. Tantawi's reading of that. I think there is a very long history of a very contentious relationship between the Brotherhood and the regime. And I think the travesty in all this is that many Egyptians, including those of us in the diaspora, thought that January 25th was going to create a third way, a new way. And that third way, which presumably was the revolutionary youth, was the impoverished youth, the middle class that's dwindling, you know, those who were what you will call the silent majority and didn't have a vested interest in the political status quo, is that they, in effect, were marginalized by both of those major stakeholders, both by the Brotherhood and both by what we'll call the deep state, the status quo regime, absent Mubarak as the head. And what's troubling for me as an attorney is that many of these laws are perpetuating that binary. And even though it's used to justify quashing the Brotherhood as part of this dance, as Ms. Tantawi said, it is in effect setting the stage to make it virtually impossible for that third way to rise up and become a voice for a large swath of Egyptians.
Well,
so I
at
think
that
that's
particular point, I'm afraid we've come
about.
to an end of this discussion. My thanks to my guests, Sahar Aziz, Sahar Eltantawi, and Abdullah Alshaal. A reminder that Al Jazeera has been unable to report from Egypt this year. That's because our team there is in detention and has been since December the 29th. Peter Gresti, Mohamed Fahmy and Baher Mohammed are falsely accused of providing a platform for the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood. Abdullah Al-Shami from Al Jazeera's Arabic channel has been detained without trial since last August. Al Jazeera rejects all charges against its staff and continues to demand their immediate release. And you can keep up to date with Al Jazeera's extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Egypt on air and online. Let us know your thoughts. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching. From me and all the team, goodbye for now.